On today's show, the Capitals place Vincent Iorio on waivers. What was the Capitals' thought process behind it, and what does it mean for Vinny? I'll discuss next on this edition of Locked On Capitals.
Your Locked On Capitals, your daily podcast on the Washington Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, hello and welcome into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Dan Holmi. I've covered the Capitals for the past 3 seasons for Locked On and various other outlets before that. I'm also the host of the weekly show called The Capitals Minutecast, available wherever you find your podcasts. And as always, I want to thank you for making this your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting fanduel.com and win $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So in this edition of Locked On Capitals, questions for the Capitals in this episode. Pierre-Luc Dubois being out due to an injury, and Connor McMichael in at center. It presents some interesting opportunities for Spencer Carberry. What will be the outcome? I'll talk about that a bit later. What to watch? There's a lot of moving pieces here. Does Vincent Iorio clear waivers? What does it mean when Pierre-Luc Dubois is good to go? Hendricks up here. So much to get to. But let's dive into the headline story of this afternoon. And Vincent Iorio is placed on waivers by the Capitals. And this is something, that probably would have happened a lot earlier had it not been for the Dylan McElrath injury. We know that he was the extra defender last year. And we know that the Capitals traded for and acquired Declan Chisholm this past summer. So it seemed like both those players were pretty well buttoned up. But an interesting question for the Capitals, isn't it? And very risky, is that they decided to put Vincent Iorio, a guy that I believe right off the top here has a much better skill set, a more multi-dimensional player, and very well could get scooped up. Now, as I record this at 7:10 Eastern, he has not been claimed. But it's a risky move. And you take a look at Dylan McElrath, and I'm not here to say that he's not a good player, but a bit single dimensional, a guy that's not a quick skater, a guy that's pretty much muscle and deterrent. And, that has a place in the NHL as well. Just a bit of a head scratcher. So let's dive into, in segment 1 here, down to more of a granular level and ultimately why the Capitals made the decision that they did. But, that was the big news this afternoon. My phone was blowing up there hearing about the news there that Vincent Iorio on waivers. And this transaction is the headline because it tells you a lot about what the Capitals are thinking. They had to make a roster decision, and ultimately they opted to bring Dylan McElrath back into the picture as he is getting closer and closer to returning, which pushed Iorio into a spot where the team needed to expose him to waivers. And, again, a risky move, a guy that's got a good upside that you got to think a team is going to take a flyer on him. And there was questions, and I'll talk about him a little bit later in the show about Pierre-Luc Dubois. As it, turns out, it doesn't sound like he's going to miss too much time. I've heard that before. And maybe, the Capitals are weighing their options, if they have to bring up another forward, what do? So that is why they made that decision. But talking about why they exposed him to the waiver wire it's not that he was a bad player. Far from it. I sing the praises of Vincent Iorio. I think, like I said, all preseason. And if you're, watching this on YouTube, you can't tell on the audio side, I have my fingers pinched as closely together as I possibly can. He's that close to being NHL ready. I think he very well could, be NHL ready. Could use a little bit of refining, but all things considered, I think that he would, at a minimum, be a good extra. And he earned that extended look based on how well he played in camp. He did the things, that Spencer Carberry and everyone told him to do. He packed on weight in the offseason. so he wasn't so easily driven off the puck. And he looked like he belonged, right? And that's half the battle, most of the time, is looking like you fit in. Like, a lot of times when it's a younger-ish type player, you're like, why is the young guy out here? But here's the reality. Iorio is 22 years old. And the feeling is well, that he needs minutes. And he needs minutes for sure. But are those minutes that he's going to get in, are they going to be within the Capitals organization? Maybe you should have thought a little bit harder about that. Now, to be clear here, I thought that Clay Stevenson getting scooped up by another team was a kind of a foregone conclusion. As it turned out, I think his contract was a bit prohibitive. And the two other options that were in the NHL as those players got scooped up. But I'm here to say there is a distinct possibility that Vincent Iorio gets scooped up. And like I said, the story we're being told and the kind of the prevailing thought amongst everyone is so he can get in this meaningful time in Hershey. Like I said, if he makes it to Hershey, that's the thing, right? But sitting as an extra defenseman on an NHL bench for week after week probably hurts his development more than it helps. And I hear that. If the plan is for him to be a Capital at some point on the blue line, which I think that it is, then it is. It is a good thing for him to get more reps in. It's just the part that's risky that has me worried. So if he clears waivers, he reports to Hershey and gets the usage he needs. But that is risky. Another team, like I said, could scoop him up, and that would sting. As I do this show. I've done this show for 4 years, and I've always revered him as the future on the blue line. There's just kind of always been a player ahead of him, or he's faced injury, those kind of things. And he's had a couple of sips of coffee with the Capitals before on the big team. But maybe that is what's best for him if the Caps can't give him big minutes right now, that they understand the risk. And I think that they feel comfortable enough with the pipeline that, they want him to go to Hershey. They understand the risk. And if it means he gets scooped up, so be it. We wish him nothing but the best in his future hockey endeavors. And honestly, when you take a look at those risks, it's a tough move. Anytime you invite someone to camp and they have to, or, you call them up and, understand that they have to get sent down, it's a risk to take. Now, do we keep a young guy on a limited role on the team for depth, or let him play heavier minutes and hopefully come back better? That's the hope, of course, is that he clears. And I, of course, sincerely hope that he does. I think the Caps decided that it was worth the risk. And ultimately, I guess time will tell if that was worthy or worthwhile to do. A bit more, few details on how and why McIlrath looks like he's close to full health. Coach Carberry said he expects McIlrath to be back to 100% and ready to fully practice and play this week. So a change was coming. And like I said, as far as Vincent is concerned, this would have happened earlier had it not been for the McIlrath injury. What do I think the Capitals like in Dylan? He is the muscle. He's the physicality. He's the guy that if the Capitals are playing a heavy team that likes to be physical, they can put him in the lineup, and it takes some of the pressure off Tom Wilson to be the tough guy. And at some point, I would imagine Ryan Leonard as well. But when McIlrath comes off injured reserve, that forces a 23-man roster decision. That is the exact mechanism that precipitated the Vincent Iorio move. So when you hear, quote, Iorio on waivers, don't automatically think it's bad for him. I don't think that it was ever a bad statement about him. I do think, however, and I'm a homer here, being a Capitals fan, that if he gets scooped up by someone else, you got to be thinking to yourself, why? But it's a roster math decision, right? And it's a developmental decision. We got to ultimately, at the end of the day, look out what's best for Vincent. But let's talk about for upside for a second, because Iorio is a big right shot defenseman. He's got the size. Like I said, he put on the weight in the offseason. He's got the kind of tools that teams covet on defense, length, reach, physicality, and a right-hand shot. And what we saw in the preseason, I think he looked much improved. over any other version of Vincent Iorio I've ever seen before. If he gets consistent minutes in Hershey, he can iron out the details. But I don't want to be in this position with him again. Like, if he gets called up, I want there to be a real feeling that he's going to stick. Because, you take a look at it. If another team claims him, then, hey, they got an NHL opportunity somewhere else. And that's the big picture, right? That I'm happy for the guy, the kid, in a lot of ways, Vincent Iorio. But those are, concerning things and the outcomes and what shakes out there. Now, I want to slow down here and make sure we're tracking the human side. Young player, big moment. That's stressful. Being waived is a weird mix of hope and anxiety. There's got to be a bit of, I don't know, abandonment. If you're a person that has abandonment issues or feeling like you're left out or why me, I don't think he's wired that way. I'm just thinking that, if you're prone to being that way, you might think that way. Like, what did I do wrong, right? And maybe I'm reading too much into it and I'm not a pro hockey player, that I'm not well-versed in the thought process. I understand the thought process. Don't get me wrong. It's just that to a certain extent, he's got to be thinking to himself, did I do something wrong here? I want it to be abundantly clear that I don't think that, he did anything wrong. So big picture takeaway from here, that you take a look at Vincent Iorio getting put on waivers in hopes that he clears and is sent to Hershey for more playing time, for more development. So he's not spending the entire season sitting up in the press box in his fancy clothes. I get that. And Dylan McElrath, again, it's my belief that they like him because of who he is. He's a big dude. He's physical. He's got muscle. He's a deterrent. And I think that ultimately that's why they chose to do it, because they understood I would rather have Dylan McElrath sitting in the press box, in his early 30s here, over a young guy that still maybe needs a little bit more time to marinate down in Hershey. Tough decisions for the Capitals organization. Tough decisions that I'm glad I don't have to make. All right, so coming up here after the break, we'll talk about McMichael moves to center. Listen, we knew he was going to be good. Did we know he was going to be that good? What does that mean around the Pierre-Luc Dubois injury? And what are some of my reactions to the line combos? I'll discuss straight ahead. Most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. That's why there's Monarch Money. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or on your phone. Monarch is built for people with busy lives. If you've put off organizing your finances, Monarch is for you. Monarch does the heavy lifting. You can link all your accounts in minutes, see clear data visuals, get smart categorization of your spending, and finally feel in control of your money without ever touching a spreadsheet. Now, the thing I absolutely loved about it, and I know you will too, is you're able to see where you're spending your money wisely and maybe where you could use some work. And if you have a significant other in your life, you can help plan your financial future together. There's so much to like, and I know you will love it as well. Don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with the code LOCKEDONNHL. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. You can find me on Twitter. It's at DanCaps218. You can find the show on Twitter. It's at Locked On Caps. So in the second segment here, we're talking about questions at the center position. And there wasn't a whole lot going into the season. I guess I would say that the third line center position was the one that had the most questions, and it seemed answered, right, that it is going to be Hendrik Slop here, even though, we were told that it was going to be Connor McMichael to get the first kick at the can. As it turns out, Hendrik Slop here came in this season into camp a man on a mission and earned that spot. I don't want to diminish what he did. He earned that spot over Connor McMichael, I guess you could say. And Connor McMichael slid back to where he was before, that second line left wing. However, What do we know about Connor McMichael is he said that, if I had my say, I'd like to get back to where I'm most comfortable, and that is the center position. Hard part, there was no spot available. You take a look up at up the center there. It was Strome, Pierre-Luc Dubois, Hendrix Lapierre, and Nick Dowd. There was a logjam straight up the center until Pierre-Luc Dubois got injured. And at the time, we didn't know how long it was going to be. As it turns out, it doesn't sound like it's going to be for too long, but an interesting opportunity for Spencer Carberry to get a good look at Connor McMichael, right? That we saw in the last game, that sweet pass to Alexei Protas that found the back of the net. That definitely kind of, I think, put his nose up like, that looks pretty good there. So let's dive into that in the second segment, talking about questions, I guess, at center and line combos that I thought were interesting, shall we say. So we know that Pierre-Luc Dubois is out with an injury, and like we're hearing, it's not supposed to be long-term. Coach Carberry said that there's reason to expect Dubois could be back skating soon. That's the important caveat, right? Because not long-term. If it was long-term, I think that would have meant a call-up. I think that would have meant more time, for Sonny Milano in the mix. I think that would have meant more time for Connor McMichael at the center position. So in a lot of ways, a win-win for the player, but would it be a win-win for the team? So again, I'm going to view this as good news in the regard that Pierre-Luc Dubois, at least as of right now, appears to be trending back to a return. But still, any missed time from a top six forward creates a ripple effect. Like I said, so the Caps slid Connor McMichael to center. Now, Connor's been clear for a while. He wants to be a center with the team. And it was a post or the breakdown day last year. It wasn't the first time. He said it multiple occasions that, that's where I'd like to get back to. That's where I'm comfortable. And when you think about it, that's great for the team. That he wants to play there. He plays very well at the wing, but it gives Spencer Carberry options when situations like Pierre-Luc Dubois getting injured arises. Now, flexibility is the name of the game. Early on the season, you're still trying to solidify, line combos and deep pairings. And if McMichael can handle center minutes, suddenly the coach can move pieces around and match opponents and limit weaknesses. And all things considered, the last game against the Lightning, it was a bit of a shootout, right? That it wasn't an easy win for the Capitals, I guess is what I'm going to say. And, I kind of thought, I was concerned with Pierre-Luc Dubois out of the mix. How would the Capitals fare? I know that, he doesn't find the back of the net, on any given night. But if you kind of just concentrate on what PLD means to the Capitals when he's out on the ice, he plays a big role. But the good news, Connor McMichael did a good job. Now, let me break down what I saw in the game where McMichael slid into the middle. He was between Tom Wilson and Alexei Protas. That's a heavy line. Those are some big dudes. Like I said in yesterday's show, that if you put PLD in there, it almost looks like a line on a football team. It was matched against the tough competition, and they generated good chances. And McMichael picked up an assist on that sweet goal by Alexei Protas. And he was engaged on both ends. That if he is trying to generate more points with Spencer Carberry, I think he did that. He drove the puck. He made plays in transition. That's the kind of stuff that make coaches comfortable when making a decision about who to play in the middle. And now let's be honest here. Face-offs, if Connor is at the center regularly, the face-off numbers matter. And, there's some centers that are better at it than others. And, Connor McMichael not getting a ton of reps in at the center position, it is good for, to get some of that work in. And he won a modest share in the game. That's an area to monitor. Can he improve on that? I think that, of course, he can. If it can improve face-off wins, that's a big plus. If not, the coach might need to shelter him in certain zone starts. Again, I don't think that we need to read too much into it, given the fact that PLD is trending towards returning. However, That's not going to be the only injury that the Capitals face, and it very well could be to another center. I'm talking Strome, Lapierre, Dow, this kind of thing. Another effect of Dubois' absence is the power play usage. Dubois is important man there when he's out, the PP personnel shuffle. And what I saw is Sonny Milano picking up some of Dubois' spot on the power play. And that's also an interesting wrinkle because you take a look at it, and if you saw Milano in the preseason, the guy has skills for days. Milano's got skills and can be a creative player with the puck. But the power play is about chemistry and set pieces. So will Milano slide in cleanly? I guess it remains to be seen, right? How much opportunity Milano is ultimately going to get. The Capitals struggling in the first game of the season, and what Sonny Milano meant to this team in the preseason games, still many questions for Carbs to answer. But let's talk about matchups here. With McMichael in the middle, the Caps can now throw different looks at opponents. You can go heavy, you can balance in speed and structure, and if Lapierre is healthy and playing that third line center, that gives your team more balance across the lines. So you take a look at it. If Dubois misses a short stretch, which, like I said, it does appear that is the case, McMichael's role grows. And I think, like I said, I think this is going to get bookmarked into Spencer Carberry's head that, wow, that worked. I might want to get a little bit more of a look at that. That could be a huge chance for him to show he's a long-term solution at center. Again, I hate to say it, but, Hendrix Lapierre signed a bridge deal that, if for some reason he doesn't work, hey, I'm your option at the third line center. If Dubois comes back quickly, McMichael returns to wing. Either way, it's an audition for Connor, and all things considered, I think that he passed the test. Sometimes they put players in just to see how they work. And, it's shortly after the game starts, they're like, whoa, we don't need to see any more of that. I don't think there was ever any concern about that with Connor McMichael, but I do think that if there was any concern by Spencer Carberry, that was put at bay, considering what we saw from Connor McMichael in the last game. All right, so coming up here after the break, we'll talk about big picture, what to watch. How does Pierre-Luc Dubois look when he comes back? What is the future of Sonny Milano in the lineup? I'll break it all down straight ahead. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel has an offer that you do not want to miss. Right now, new customers can bet just $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win. That's right, pick a bet, put down $5, and if it hits, you'll unlock $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Now, me personally, I love how FanDuel gives me so many different ways to play. I've built parlays, tried player props, and even followed the live lines during the game. And the thing that I like is, I'm sure the thing that you like on any given Sunday, my team's playing, whether you like the Commanders or the Ravens, you already are into the game, right? But say you want vested interest in all of the games, including the teams that you like. Open up the FanDuel app, put a little bit of money on the game. All of a sudden, they got that much more exciting. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app today to get started. All right, welcome back into this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The best way that you can help grow the show is to subscribe to Locked On Capitals on YouTube and comment anything down below. And also Locked On Capitals Insiders. You guys got to sign up for this. There's more information in the show notes. You'll get special texts, exclusive content, stuff that you're not going to see on Twitter from yours truly. Sign up for the Capitals Insiders today. All right, in the final segment of today's show, we're talking about what to watch in the games going forward. More specifically, the Capitals have the Minnesota Wild on deck. And, a team that's been a bit of a mixed bag, the Minnesota Wild. I think the trajectory, or the projections rather, are that they're going to be a good team, a step forward. But it's going to be a good test. Another good test is what I'm going to say for the Capitals. So let's talk about questions surrounding this team and big picture things to watch. So putting it all together, The moves that we've seen. I'm talking about Milano in there. I'm talking about, Dylan McElrath and where he fits in. And Pierre-Luc Dubois, here's what I'm seeing first. Development versus depth. Just talking about the Iorio thing shows that the Caps prefer to get a young player meaningful minutes in Hershey rather than keep them on the bench as a long-term answer. Now, that's a philosophical choice, and I understand it. I guess I don't necessarily love it. But that is a question. And one of the biggest things to watch is if Vincent Iorio clears. Of course, I will have you guys covered the entire way on Locked On Capitals on YouTube, the podcast, or again, like I said, on the Locked On Capitals Insiders. Now, it's one I generally like because the long season eats teams who don't have depth that can set up the midseason. If there's injuries, you need a guy to step up. And you got to think, if there is an injury at the center, or on defense, that Vincent Iorio is going to be an option, right? It's an interesting thing here that, you're up, you get sent down. I think the Capitals are hoping that he can refine his game, what needs to be refined, and that if there is any, injuries or inconsistent play, then he could slide up. Big thing. And if Iorio becomes a better player in the AHL and rises, that is a net positive for the franchise. Either way, you hope the net effect is growth. And the second thing I want to talk about here is positional flexibility is huge. In the second segment there, I talked about Connor McMichael showing that he can play center, he can play at wing, and that is so valuable that, like I said, injuries are going to be a thing. Players are not going to be what you thought in the preseason or in the beginning of the season. You need depth. That's where a guy like Connor McMichael comes in, a guy that can kill it at the forward position, whether it be the wing or the center. That is huge because flexibility helps during injuries, of course. And right now, injuries are the NHL's favorite equalizer. Third, keep a close eye on injuries and timelines. Again, Pierre-Luc Dubois is right there as things to monitor. Right there with Vincent Iorio. If Iorio clears, that is what's on top of my radar right now. Pierre-Luc Dubois returning to this team, that's right up there as well. And like I said, everything that we have heard thus far is that it is going to be a shorter injury. Again, fingers and toes crossed here, as we didn't think Sonny Milano, for example, was going to miss as much time as he did. So monitor both of those players. That is for sure. And fourth is special teams. And wow, circle, underline, boldface type here. Can they fix the power play? Can they fix it? The teams that do it well, they kill it on special teams. The power play, the PK, I'm talking here more specifically, you got to make good on the power play. I understand the Capitals did it. They picked up a power play goal against the Bolts. Yeah, that's good, but I'm not content with that. We need to see a whole lot more. So those are the things to watch there as well. Also, I'm talking about Sonny Milano. Just going down priorities here, and what kind of role does he take on with the team? That there's I guess you're looking for inconsistent play for him to slot in there again, but it's not going to be easy. I think that if Sonny Milano wants to find a steady role with this team, he has got to nail it like he did in the preseason when he's given an opportunity. It's a victory to make the team. I think getting Sonny more playing time, it would be advantageous. I hear all the time on Twitter, why is Sortif in, for example, and a guy like Sonny Milano out? I think that we saw improvement, relatively speaking, with Sortif in the last game. I think he was generating a little bit more there. I need, despite what Chris Patrick says, I need to see a whole lot more from Justin Sortif as well to keep him in there. I know what you said. However, I want to see a whole lot more from him as well. The other thing as well is Dylan McElrath. What kind of role does he take on with the Capitals? I know Declan Chisholm, along with Dylan McElrath, are the extra defenders for injuries. As historically, the Capitals have carried one extra forward and two extra defenders. What kind of role does he take on? Does he just step in based on injury, or will the Capitals utilize him? Like I said earlier in the show, if they're playing a more physical opponent. I like, the thing, again, when I said, it was a mistake in my estimation to go with McElrath over Vincent Iorio. It was never to disparage or to say it as a pejorative against him. All I'm saying is, who had the greater value. So I think that when the Capitals are playing a bigger team, that's for me. If I was the coach, I'd put McElrath in there. If there's a team, and there's teams around the league that have the tough guy, and that Tom Wilson is going to spend a lion's share of the time locking horns with said guy, that I think the Capitals would be good to utilize him in the mix. Those are the big stories that I'm watching here, guys. The big things here, of course, like I said, Vincent Iorio, Pierre-Luc Dubois, Sonny Milano playing time, Connor McMichael. We're early in the season and so many intriguing storylines to follow. That is why you want to keep it to Locked On Capitals. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, your only daily year-round podcast covering the Capitals. And I want to thank all of you that listen on the audio side and watch this on YouTube. You are what makes this show successful. And now that the NHL season is going on here, your first listen today, for your second listen, check out Locked On NHL Game Night. Every game, every night until the Stanley Cup is crowned. All right, once again, I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Locked On Capitals, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. It is your team every day. My name is Dan Holmi, and I'll talk to you again next time.